Not to be overly dramatic, but last year I thought my best friend was dying. My dog Indy suddenly got really clumsy, tripping over his own feet, having trouble jumping up on the sofa, and even as we were rushing to the car to get to the vet, he couldn't navigate the staircase to get down, and so he had to be carried. I won't leave you hanging. He's fine. The vet examined him and diagnosed him with idiopathic vestibular disease. Something I had never heard in my life, but I was overjoyed to hear just then because turns out it was temporary and not painful or deadly for Indy. The vestibular system is what many animals use to maintain their balance. And for most mammals, like you and me and Indy, that's mostly done in the inner ear with help from the eyes and, of course, the brain. So vestibular disease means that Indy's balance was thrown off somehow, and idiopathic just means we don't know why. It just happens sometimes. Note that there can be reasons for it. Tumors, a knock on the head, stuff like that. But oftentimes they just call it idiopathic because they don't know. It just happens. And when it does happen, dogs and humans both tend to just sort of get better over the coming weeks. The only lasting damage for Indy is a permanent head tilt, which doesn't bother him. And honestly, it makes him like 20% cuter. So we're all fine with it. What I didn't consider at the time, though, was that perhaps it wasn't idiopathic. Perhaps there was an identifiable cause. Perhaps Russian spies parked outside my house targeted Indy with a top-secret energy device for the purpose of causing him severe discomfort and to scare him away from criticizing the fascist Putin regime. Perhaps Indy actually had Havana syndrome. A few months ago, one of my patrons actually asked me on my monthly Q&A live stream if I had considered doing a video about Havana syndrome. And the fact is that yeah, I had considered it, but never bothered for a couple of reasons. For one, it is a huge issue involving shadowy governments, and I just never felt like I had enough data to form a unique, interesting, or even like a solid opinion for you. And also, there just wasn't any recent news to make it relevant. Well, I've now spent a solid week of reading about international political intrigue, research on auditory and microwave weapons, medical case studies, and far too many definitive debunkings. And now I'm finally ready. Let's talk about Havana syndrome. Back in 2017, the mainstream news reported that dozens of US and Canadian diplomats in Cuba had been impacted by mysterious acoustic attacks, leading to a variety of symptoms, many of which seemed related to the vestibular system. Nausea, headaches, and dizziness, but also memory loss, hearing loss, and brain fog. Many of the diplomats insisted that it was a direct attack, and some of them said that they were attacked multiple times at work and at home. Cuba denied any involvement, and rumors abounded that it may have actually been the work of China or Russia. Many skeptics rushed in to point out that this had all the hallmarks of mass psychogenic illness, or what we used to call mass hysteria. I've discussed this several times in the past, like when I covered the epidemic of teens catching Tourette's on TikTok. The brief explanation is that the symptoms experienced by people suffering from a mass psychogenic illness are absolutely real and can be debilitating, but the cause of those symptoms isn't a virus or bacteria or other environmental factor, but the victim's own fears, their own anxiety stoked by their preconceptions and suggestibility. Skeptics love a good mass psychogenic illness story. It's weird, it's based on the idea of people fooling themselves, and it provides a good logical explanation for things that may seem to be supernatural at first blush, like why did an entire medieval village suddenly start dancing against their own will? Was it Satan? No, it was merely anxiety, the tiny Satan that lives within our own brains. Robert Bartholomew is one such skeptic. He's an expert on mass psychogenic illnesses, and he has been so vehemently insistent that Havana syndrome is a mass psychogenic illness that he co-wrote an entire book about it in 2020. And last month, he wrote up an article for Skeptic magazine titled, "The Game is Up. New Study Finds No Evidence for Havana Syndrome," which Skeptic magazine publisher Michael Shermer described as a definitive debunking of the idea that Havana syndrome has anything to do with spies or weaponry or anything but basic human psychology. Amusingly, within a few days of that article hitting Skeptic, the insider 60 Minutes and Der Spiegel published the results of a year-long investigation revealing detailed evidence that suggests Havana syndrome is real and is caused by directed energy weapons wielded by members of Russian GRU Unit 29155. And that just was too juicy. That's where I said, okay, I'm finally going to sit down and read up on all of this. I'm going to try my best to describe what each side has to say about this, but if you want to go straight to the sources, as always, you can find links to everything freely available in the transcript on my Patreon, which is directly linked below. So, to start, Bartholomew hangs his conclusive debunking on two studies recently published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, stating that these studies failed to find any evidence of brain or inner ear damage in victims of Havana syndrome. I've read both studies. One found no evidence of existing brain damage in supposed Havana syndrome patients using MRIs, but the other study did find significant differences between Havana patients and a control group when it came to both objective and self-reported measures of imbalance and symptoms of fatigue, post-traumatic stress, and depression. Bartholomew further states that previous studies that did find evidence of brain damage were clearly flawed, and any competent mainstream scientist who read them would have seen these shortcomings. He links to two long reads as a citation there. One is from Vanity Fair, the other is from the New Yorker. And lucky you, again, I read them, so you don't have to if you don't want. The New Yorker article from 2021 only describes a study by the University of Pennsylvania Center for Brain Injury and Repair, which used MRIs to study the brains of 40 patients with suspected Havana syndrome, and they found signs consistent with damage to the patient's brains. The volume of white matter was smaller than in a similar group of healthy adults, which indicated that something structural in the brain had been affected. And they don't describe any criticism of the study that I could find. But back in 2019, Jack Hitt did write for Vanity Fair that when the Journal of the American Medical Association published a report by the initial medical team, it also ran a hand-wringing editorial undermining the very article it was publishing. The initial clinical evaluations, the JAMA editors observed, were not standardized. The examiners were not blinded, and some of the ailments were based on patient self-report. There was a lack of baseline evaluations and the absence of a control. Those factors, the editors concluded, along with the fact that many of the reported symptoms occur in the general population, meant that the results of the study are complicated. The editors added a disclaimer, much like the one in Bush v. Gore, don't ever cite this case in the future, urging caution in interpreting the findings. The editors suspected that skeptical scientists would attack the study, which is exactly what happened. The chief editor of Cortex, Sergio Della Sala, ridiculed the author's methods specifically for setting a low bar for reporting embassy staffers as impaired, resulting in numerous false positives. Take the symptom of tinnitus. Some 50 million Americans, 1 in 6 people, experience ringing in the ears. If the JAMA scientists had assessed any group of normal, healthy people using the same criteria they applied to the diplomats, Della Sala pointed out, they would have found several of them performing below the chosen cutoff score in one or another test. Okay, so we have some possibly flawed earlier studies, new studies that found no evidence for a specific type of brain damage, and finally Bartholomew attacks David Relman, the Stanford microbiologist who has taken up the cause of proving Havana syndrome is real and likely caused by some kind of unknown weapon. Bartholomew says that Relman has basically swerved out of his scientific lane, that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that he has refused to allow doctors to examine the patients who Relman thinks present the most clear-cut cases of Havana syndrome. Bartholomew doesn't mention this, possibly because the audience for Skeptic magazine would not actually see this as a red flag. But I do think it's worth noting that Relman is also one of the scientists who has been wooed by the lab leak hypothesis for the origins of COVID-19. long after the experts published very clear and convincing data that the origin was most likely in the wet markets of Wuhan. In my opinion, that does show a willingness to ignore the experts in favor of a more exciting story of a massive government conspiracy when looking at the science outside of Relman's actual expertise. So that, to me, is a red flag. A few other things worth noting. There are stories that Patient Zero in Havana was very focused on convincing everyone that he was definitely attacked and that because of that, he may have convinced his coworkers to interpret every weird sound or sensation as an attack. Also, some recordings of the weird sounds that diplomats claim to have heard when experiencing attacks turned out to possibly be particularly annoying crickets. Finally, early investigations that have since been declassified failed to find evidence that a weapon was used in any of the cases. Okay, on to the report from 60 Minutes, an American investigative TV show, Der Spiegel, a German newspaper, and The Insider, which is an independent site run by Russian exiles who debunk Russian propaganda efforts, and which previously discovered and revealed the Russian secret agents behind several assassinations and assassination attempts, including the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. The most information you'll find is in the report on The Insider, but if you'd prefer to have someone other than me talk to you about it in more detail, you can watch the 60 Minutes segment on YouTube in full, depending on what country you're in, probably. Again, the link is in the transcript. Here's the overview, though. They discuss how the illness wasn't contained to diplomats in Havana, but in fact, earlier cases were reported in Germany, and later cases were in China, Russia, and Ukraine, and elsewhere, including inside the United States. And in fact, nearly all the cases involved the most successful U.S. spies working in counterintelligence specifically focused on Russia. So that's interesting because you'd think if it was just a psychogenic illness, you would see this illness spread through offices regardless of the victim's rank or their specific job or specialty. They profile many of the victims whose stories certainly don't sound like anxiety and often include the agent's spouses and children and even household pets, suggesting that perhaps Indy was not targeted. Perhaps I was the target and he was just felled by friendly fire. Just something to think about. I mean, I'm not a spy, but if I were a spy, would I even tell you? No. Actually, yeah, I probably would. That's probably why they never let me be a spy. Anyway, let's move on. Considering the participation of the Insider, it's no surprise that the real meat of this investigation focuses on Unit 29155, a notorious assassination and sabotage squad of the GRU, Moscow's military intelligence service. The report meticulously catalogs the usual suspects of 29155, showing loads of data and evidence that places various agents in the exact cities around the world where U.S. agents claim to be struck by this unknown weapon. Some of the U.S. agents even confirmed seeing those Russian agents lurking nearby at the time of the incident. Finally, the team addresses the elephant in the room that I haven't even touched on yet, because Bartholomew doesn't seriously contend with it. Is such a weapon even possible? They dug up evidence showing that not only has Russia been experimenting with non-lethal acoustic and microwave weapons for decades, something that doesn't appear to be controversial. Other countries, including the United States, have done this as well. But also that senior agents for 29155 were actually promoted for successfully testing such weapons as recently as 2019. It's also worth noting that they found documents showing that U.S. officials were nervous about agents connecting these illnesses to Russia, suggesting that it's a tenuous relationship that we might not want to disrupt because the result of Russia directly attacking U.S. agents in this way would be like a nuclear war with Putin. I've played a lot of Civilization, so I understand that sometimes you have to ignore a little espionage if you want to avoid Gandhi turning one of your cities into Chernobyl. The report concludes by comparing Havana syndrome to Gulf War syndrome, another mysterious and much scrutinized disease that affected military veterans on both sides of the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991. 250,000 soldiers reported a multitude of chronic illnesses for a decade following their deployment, and skeptics were very insistent that this was a mass psychogenic illness. Here's reporter John Stossel in 2001 calling it a nocebo in discussion with James Randi. The veterans have real symptoms, but major studies have found no germ or pattern of chemicals that could explain how the war caused those symptoms. If they were caused by chemicals, you'd expect the soldiers closest to the action to be sickest, but that's not the case. All that publicity about poison gas, environmental toxins, about other soldiers getting sick, that plus the stress of military service can make people sick. From believing it, some people really get sick, to which Randi replies, whether something's really there or not may be irrelevant. It may just be the belief system at work. Yeah, spoiler alert, but Gulf War syndrome is real. A study in 2022 confirmed that people with a particular genetic makeup were unable to metabolize sarin nerve gas and thus were more likely to experience the symptoms associated with Gulf War syndrome. But I bet they just really enjoyed watching that John Stossel segment. Of course, just because Gulf War syndrome turned out to be real, it doesn't mean Havana syndrome is really caused by Russian agents with a secret weapon. Personally, I have no idea what's true. I don't find the hypothesis particularly extraordinary. Militaries are always experimenting with new weapons. The technology is within the realm of possibility. Russian agents have been fucking around like this for decades. The US military is always trying to hide what they know or don't know. And we as a society tend to not give a shit about the health of the people who claim to be protecting our sacred way of life. The worst argument I think I've seen in this whole thing comes from skeptics who say, but why would the US government lie about this or not try to get to the bottom of this? And I'm like, have you met the US government? Do you think they're just super excited to pay for medical expenses for anybody? Jon Stewart fought for 2 decades to get anyone in Congress to give a single shit about the healthcare of first responders who survived September 11th. All of that is in addition to the possibility of admitting that it's Russia and putting us into a nuclear war. But all that said, no, we still don't have any evidence of a weapon. We, the general public, and honestly, we, the general public, probably won't for another several decades because that's how long it's going to take to be declassified, except in the case of a brave whistleblower. While I appreciate critics like Bartholomew raising important points about the validity of certain studies and the existence of alternate hypotheses, I have to admit I do find it gross and inappropriate to claim that an MRI study failing to find evidence of brain damage is a definitive debunking. Even James Randi was very careful to avoid the word debunk because of its negative connotations. And I really wish skeptics would go back to that. Like, let's hang on to the word debunk for when we're really super sure that something is frivolous misinformation that we have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Because calling these studies and that essay from Bartholomew a debunk is just going to make people roll their eyes and completely dismiss anything you have to say. And honestly, maybe they would be right to do so, judging by Bartholomew's hasty follow-up rebuttal to the 60 Minutes episode. It's the Russians. The latest 60 Minutes episode on Havana syndrome engages in tabloid journalism. Bartholomew rails against every aspect of the show, though it seems that he didn't even know about the more in-depth report over on The Insider, nor did he apparently know about the previous episodes 60 Minutes has done on this, because he complains that David Rellner shows up, but that was actually a clip from their previous episode on Havana syndrome. It was just to give background and context to these new findings. He complains that all of the spies they interviewed were kept anonymous because I guess Bartholomew assumes that 60 Minutes and their partners failed to fact check their sources, and only he can confirm these people's stories. He criticizes one woman because she says that the man she saw lurking outside of her house when she was attacked looks like a Russian agent whose picture she was shown, though she cautions that she can't be absolutely sure. Wow, a witness who understands that witness identification is error-prone. Burn her. Burn the witch. He then says that brain fog, one of her many symptoms, is a common description of people experiencing anxiety, which is a common tactic known as poisoning the well. Brain fog is also a common description of people experiencing long COVID and pregnancies. So what? And when it's revealed that this woman has had several surgeries to fix holes in her ear canals, Bartholomew says she probably got it scuba diving. This is why I'm actually being very kind by suggesting Bartholomew hastily scribbled this reaction down, because I want to believe that if he had had an extra 5 to 10 minutes, he could have thought of about 100 less shitty ways to suggest that her symptoms might be due to a different cause. Maybe while he could have admitted that he has no idea what she's been through besides that short clip he saw in 60 Minutes, and that he's not an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and he's not any doctor at all, and he's certainly not her doctor, then he calls it all propaganda and ends his response. I went into Bartholomew's first article giving him the benefit of the doubt. Sure, it's a bad headline, and Shermer promoted it in a very dishonest way by suggesting it was a comprehensive debunk, but it was important information that countered the existing narrative. But this sloppy follow-up is so embarrassing that it makes him sound like someone who only has a hammer and would like every problem to be a nail. I'm an expert in mass psychogenic illness, and I know a psychogenic illness when I see one. I just want to end by stressing that it's okay to admit when you don't know something for sure. It's okay to say, hey, these early studies had some issues, so we need more evidence. Or, hey, here's another possible explanation for what's happening. It's fine to point out the likelihood of things being true or not, and to call out completely ridiculous things when you see them. But it's so incredibly egocentric to sit on your sofa in New Zealand and claim that you conclusively know what shadowy world governments are getting up to. And you specifically know the explanation for the ill health of hundreds of top secret counterintelligence agents around the world. I mean, I don't know that. I don't think you know that. One day the world will probably know for sure, but today is not that day. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.